Okay, well, we left off with the message part, as we saw in the first part. Key thing is to get your message out, and the media is very important. There's parts of it like the independent candidates have a tougher time, but nevertheless, they go out and they try to put out their message. Oftentimes today, what we get are sound bites on television and radio, and some campaigns involve mudslinging or just going after a person's character. Sometimes it's of ethical question. It's questionable ethics wise. As far as negative campaigning, well, it goes on. There's no question about it. There's been suggestions to eliminate it, but to eliminate it means interfering with someone's free speech. Right now, the corporations are doing a pretty good job of trying to limit the free speech of individuals they disagree with. Some say we should increase free media access. Social media now is used by most candidates, but there are negative downsides to it. Now, campaign finance is necessary because that's what makes the mayor go, as Lyndon Johnson said. It's obvious that candidates need money to pay the expenses of election campaigns. Now, unlike the federal government has limits. If we look at the federal elections contribution limits, you can see them posted on their website. So for an individual, it means you can give up to $2,800 per election or $4,600 for the year if you gave during the primary and the general election. Now, if you want to give to a PAC, you're limited to $5,000. To a party committee, $10,000. And if you want to give to a party committee, national party committee, $35,000. Candidate committees, they can give $2,000 per election, $5,000 to PACs. PACs can give $5,000 per election to a particular candidate. So they can give up to $10,000 to a candidate for a federal office. Now, the state doesn't have any limits except for certain judicial races. Now, the record was 45 million in a governor race in 1990 between Clayton Williams and Ann Richards, but that record was broken in 2002 when Tony Sanchez and Richard Perry ran, and Sanchez spent close to 67 million. Perry spent 25 million. Now, in both those cases mentioned in your book on page 159, the one who spent the most did not win, interestingly enough. Williams, the Republican that year in 1990, spent close to 14 million. And Richard spent 8.7 million, but won the seat. And in 2002, the same thing happened. Perry won, even though Sanchez outspent him almost 3 times to 1. So it is necessary to get the money. Now, few can pay their own expenses. Some do. Lieutenant Governor candidate David Dewhurst did in 2014, but he lost, interestingly enough. Now, some are unwilling to undertake fundraising drives designed to attract significant contributions. But candidates need to raise large amounts of money. Some city council seats require hundreds of thousands of dollars. I think sometimes our local elections raise, $10,000, $20,000. Now, some individuals and political action committees are organized to collect and distribute. PACs, those are political organizations, and they're created specifically to collect and distribute contributions to political campaigns. Now, do they influence candidates in politics? Well, that's hard to nail down. But there are federal and state laws that basically go after the reporting. Now, in 1989, because of a chicken owner spending a lot of money giving checks out to legislators, Texas passed by 1993 something called the Texas Ethics Commission. And basically what they do is they keep track of all the money to make sure that all of it is reported. This is all in the Texas Elections Code as it relates to campaign fundraising, expenditures, advertising, and ethics. Now, there's been some restricting at the federal level under the Campaign Reform Act passed by Congress and signed by President Bush. Now, this just deals with federal offices like U.S. Senator, U.S. Congressperson. And you cannot give money to a political party and then the party gives it to a candidate that violates the limits. That was soft money. That was banned. Now, hard money was raised. That means money directly to the candidate. But what happened was a series of cases in the last 20 years that have challenged this law, and much of the law has been eroded. At first, it was supported, like in the McConnell versus Federal Elections Commission. That's the same McConnell running for Senate in Kentucky. That was unsuccessful, and the law was upheld. However, 7 years later, in a 5-4 decision, Citizens United changed all of that. And let me do a series of videos that might help you understand a little bit of this money in politics.
People get concerned whenever money and politics mix. We're concerned that large expenditures of money raise the possibility of corruption of public office holders. And we're concerned about what it does to our notions of political equality. And yet, for most of our history, money in politics has been unregulated. Oh, sure, there were some laws that go back to the early 20th century that had some limits in place, but for the most part, they were unenforceable and unenforced. That changed in the 1970s when people decided that if we just regulated more, maybe we could get rid of corrupt politicians. And if we just regulated more, maybe we'd all be just a little more equal when it came to politics. How's that worked? Well, by most measures, it hasn't worked all that well. In fact, we found that since the passage of the Federal Election Campaign Act in 1974 and the various state laws that were modeled on it, the incumbent spending advantage has gone from about 1.5 to 1 to nearly 4 to 1. That is, what incumbents spend vis-a-vis challengers has gone through the roof. We also find, not surprisingly, that incumbents win re-election at ever higher rates and have fewer and fewer bona fide challengers from election to election. And we found that it's very, very hard for a true grassroots campaign to get off the ground. Right now, the Federal Elections Commission has hundreds of pages of regulations that one has to pour through if you want to know how to run a campaign. And beyond that, there are dozens and dozens, hundreds, literally, of advisory opinions from the commission trying to explain to people what their obligations are in particular situations. The Supreme Court has noted that there are over 30 different types of speech that are regulated by the Federal Election Campaign Act and the Federal Election Commission regulations. What does this do to the grassroots people trying to get a campaign off the ground? What would this do to you if you decided you were going to run for office? The first thing you'd have to do is hire a lawyer, and then you'd have to hire a skilled consultant. And then you'd have to figure out how you're going to pay them, because very few people can do this as volunteers. You've got to come up with some money. You've got to come up with somebody who knows these regulations. Increasingly, politics is a specialized game for a select, elite group of people who know the ropes and can manipulate them to their advantage. You know, it's not that long ago that political campaigns would begin. A group of friends would get together, somebody would sponsor a little reception, the candidate would say a few words, and then they'd pass the hat and people would just donate. If you did that today, you'd be violating all kinds of campaign finance laws. So what do we have for our 40-year experiment with all this regulation? Do you think that there's greater political equality? Do you think that politics is less corrupt? Do you think we run the corrupt people out of the political system? Maybe it's time that we think about a new approach to politics, which just happens to be an old approach. It's called the First Amendment. The First Amendment is there that says anybody can participate in politics. All you have to do is start speaking. All you have to do is get together with your fellow citizens and start talking about what interests you and supporting the candidates that you believe in. We managed to do pretty well under that system right up until the 1970s. The more we've tried to tinker with regulation and then adding more regulation to correct the loopholes in the prior regulation, the harder it's gotten for average citizens to participate in politics and to feel connected to their government and to feel that they can make a difference. Maybe it's time for a new approach.
So he makes a good point about it, but the real thing that came about was because of just a movie, believe it or not, called Hillary the Movie. This was what Citizens United wanted to show 90 days out from the 2008 election, when Obama and well, even before that, I believe, even before the primaries. And so they wanted to show this film, but they couldn't according to the laws of under the Campaign Reform Act.
Senator Clinton is claiming basically the entire 8 years of the Clinton presidency as her own, except for the stuff that didn't work out, in which case she says she has nothing to do with it.
This is the corporation, Citizens United, that made this film.
Like she has managerial experience, as if she has policy development experience. She doesn't have any of those things. She does not answer questions straight out.
I did not say that it should be done.
You said yes.
No.
You thought it made sense to do it.
No, I didn't, Chris. But the point is, what are we going to do with all these illegal immigrants?
Unless I missed something, Senator Clinton said two different things in the course of about 2 minutes.
And she's driven by the power.
So that film set off this challenge to the Federal Elections Commission, which has to enforce the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, and they appealed based on free speech, freedom of speech. It was being violated by this unconstitutional restraint. And what this led to was these independent expenditures by people that could form corporations, and they could make movies, produce commercials, sound bites, whatever. And they could do them for or against a particular candidate. And that led to what we call these super PACs, which are these independent expenditure committees. And so you and I and a lot of people we know, we can create one. We have to follow the laws, and we can spend as much as we want on behalf of Joe Biden or Donald Trump or whichever candidate we want. We can raise unlimited amounts of money. And this is because of the Citizens United and the Speech Now case.
These days, when you talk politics, it seems like all you hear about are super PACs. And if you're like most people, most of what you hear is pretty negative. Contrary to what you might be hearing, super PACs, in fact, are creating more competition in our democracy. They're creating a more open system, and they're making more voices heard. So why are people getting so worked up? Well, there's a lot of bad information going around about super PACs, so we're going to try to set the record straight on at least a few points. Myth number one, super PACs enable corporations to control and dominate elections. What we've seen in the two election cycles so far, that is 2010, the first election with super PACs, and 2012 to date, is that corporate spending is a very small part of the super PAC picture. only about 18% comes from corporations. 55% comes from individuals, and the others 26% comes from unions and nonprofit organizations. Myth number 2, super PACs raise secret, untraceable money. Well, that's not really true. In fact, super PACs are required to report all of their donors to the Federal Election Commission, where it's made available on the Federal Election Commission website to any American who wants to look it up. And this data has to be reported quarterly, monthly, or close to elections, often within 48 hours. The complaint of some who favor more regulation is that super PACs get some of their donations from 501c4 nonprofit organizations, and those nonprofits don't have to disclose their donors. But these nonprofit organizations make up only 5.6% of the money that's going to super PACs. And furthermore, if somebody gives the money to the nonprofit specifically to run political ads, then that donor will be reported to the Federal Election Commission. The third myth we often hear is that super PACs are ruining political discourse with negative attack ads. If you don't like negative ads, super PACs are not to blame. Negative ads have been part of American politics as long as we've had elections. But empirical data from the Wesleyan Media Project shows that negative ads are actually more common from candidates and political parties than they are from super PACs. Myth number 4, super PACs benefit incumbents and the politically powerful. Super PACs, in fact, provide a check on incumbents. In 2010, 54 incumbents lost their races for Congress. In those races, super PACs and other independent spenders spent on average just a tiny bit over $900,000. But in races that incumbents won, super PACs only spent about $75,000 on average. In fact, what you see is that incumbents have a lot more money than challengers do, and super PACs help to level that playing field and make challengers competitive. Now, they have a lot of regulatory requirements, a lot of things they have to report to the federal government, a lot of forms they have to file, but conceptually, it's easy. A super PAC, you, me, whoever else we want to get involved, spending our money jointly to try to influence a political race. The only difference between a super PAC and a regular old-fashioned political action committee is that a super PAC can take unlimited funds from any source, including corporations and unions, because it doesn't give money directly to candidates. It only spends money on its own. Regular old PACs are limited in how much money they can take from any one individual, and they can't take corporate money or union money at all, but they can give money directly to candidate campaigns. Super PACs are the result of a pair of 2010 U.S. court decisions. In Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, the Supreme Court held that corporations and unions had a right to spend their money to advocate the election or defeat of candidates, not to give money to those candidates or their campaigns, but to spend money on their own to say that those people should be elected or defeated in their runs for office. The other case is one called SpeechNow.org versus Federal Election Commission, a case from the United States Court of Appeals, which held that individuals or corporations or unions had a right to pool their resources to do that same type of independent spending. Now, why are super PACs such a big deal? You know, the funny thing is that even prior to these two decisions, super PACs were allowed in the majority of the United States. 26 states allowed super PACs, allowed unlimited corporate spending. And how did those states do? Well, according to the Pew Charitable Trust and Governing Magazine, a magazine which studies governments in the states, the 6 best governed states in America were all states that allowed unlimited corporate and union expenditures even before Citizens United. There's really not much reason to think that super PACs were detrimental to democracy in any of the states where they existed prior to Citizens United and SpeechNow.org. Far from being the death knell for democracy, super PACs have been a positive development. They've created more competition, and they've made it harder for incumbents to stay in office just because they're incumbents. Super PACs have been and will continue to be a thorn in the side of entrenched political interests.
Okay. So that's the story behind all that campaign finance right now. Basically, we can form super PACs and we can give money to them, and then they can create advertisements if we want. And that's what we're being bombarded with right now, is a bunch of super PAC advertisements on candidates at the state and federal level. Now, McCutcheon was a case that allows you to give as much money as you want during a year. There's no total limit. So if you give, $4,600 to a federal candidate, you can give $4,600 to another federal candidate, and so on and so forth. you can give as as many federal candidates as there are, you can give money to them. Now, none of us are going to ever do that, but you can do that. There is not much else except to say that there are some limitations on the amount of money that you can contribute to a judicial campaign. Judicial campaigns at the bottom of page 161 are limited to $5,000 for Supreme Court and Court of Criminal Appeals, and $2,500 for candidates in areas where you have a large population, and 1,000 in areas under 250,000. Dark money is simply anonymous money. You can, and there's some circumstances, give money that is anonymous. Like if you gave money to the American Civil Liberties Union or the Sierra Club or some environmental group, that's a nonprofit group. They don't make a profit, so if you give money to them, it can be anonymous, and then they in turn can give it to a political candidate. So that's what is known as dark money. So again, to review a little bit, the Texas Ethics Commission, that's the one that requires all the financial disclosure, but it's only for state offices. For federal, it's the Federal Elections Commission. And mudslinging happens, it's when you criticize a candidate and it's criticizing them for things that they may or may not have done. So it's used in all campaigns. Let's move on to racial and ethnic politics. The impact of Texas's changing demographics in politics. In the 70s, La Raza Unida Party did evolve into a powerful force that did compel Democrats to pay more attention to Latinos. Most Anglo candidates use Spanish phrases occasionally in their advertisements. The League of United Latin American Citizens, that's been around since the 1920s, and the National Council of La Raza are appealed to by Republican and Democratic candidates. In South Texas, beginning in the 60s and 70s, Latinos greatly expanded their roles in politics. Tony Sanchez, he was a Laredo businessman, and he was the first Latino candidate for governor. And in 2017, many offices are held by Latinos. We've got 3 statewide, 1 senator, 5 U.S. representatives, 44 legislative seats in the Texas legislature, 2,200 remaining in other elected positions. %38 of Texas population is Latino. By 2020, it's estimated to be about 42%. So that's a key to the future. As far as African Americans, they make up about 13% of the population. They haven't filled many offices over time, but occasionally governors will appoint someone like a Michael Williams to the Texas Railroad Commission. We've had Texas Court of Criminal Appeals justices that have been African American. William Jefferson, he was appointed to the Supreme Court and served on that. Others have served as well on the Texas Supreme Court. Mayors of major cities like Ron Kirk. Right now we have about 5 U.S. representatives, 18 in the Texas legislature, 500 in other elected positions. Now, the role of women, only 4 women were in statewide office up until 1990. Miriam Ferguson, governor during the 20s and 30s, she did appoint Secretary of State. That was a female. By 1990, actually, female voters outnumbered male voters. And in 1990, we elected Kay Bailey Hutchinson, the first woman U.S. Senator from Texas. We've had mayors of major cities. Mayor of Dallas, Annette Strauss. Houston had the first openly gay mayor, Denise Parker. And they've successfully served since 1971 in the Texas congressional delegation and the Texas legislature. Now, as of 2016 election, in 2017, the number of women in the delegation was 3. Number of women in the Texas legislature was 36, 8 in the Senate, 28 in the House. One of the senators is Judy Zaffirini. They do tend to look at issues in a different manner. They do tend to look at child care issues, parental obligation issues, but there has been kind of a stable increase in women in state level office. Most Latinos typically do support the Democrat Party. And some years you won't have certain ethnic groups at the statewide level. Like in 2014, there was no African Americans and no Asian Americans, although they're a smaller percent of the population. And we have had 2 governors, women governors, Ann Richards in the 1990s and Ma Ferguson in the 20s and the 30s. Now, voting is universal for all 18-year-olds that are not felons, that aren't in prison. That became a reality in the mid-1960s. After the Civil War, the 14th and 15th guaranteed African American males the right to vote, but these were rights that weren't well enforced. You had the KKK, other lawless groups that would terrorize African Americans from voting, especially in East Texas. There was also efforts like the poll tax and literacy test that prevented minorities and poor whites from voting. The literacy tests were literally tests to check your literacy. Could you pass a test? They'd ask you questions about the Constitution or issues that sometimes related to citizenship. Grandfather clause was not used in Texas. This was used in other states. And it was a clause that prevented people that didn't have the right to vote before 1867 or their descendants, which many African Americans had not been able to vote. Now, this was eliminated by the Gwynn case in 1915. Poll tax, which was used in Texas beginning in 1902, to pay the cost of elections, but it would affect people that were minority, disproportionate, and poor people. If you failed to pay your poll tax, then you were not allowed to vote. And if you wanted to vote, you'd have to pay your back tax. This was eliminated in the 60s by the 24th Amendment for federal elections and the Harper case for state elections. Another thing that was used in Texas was the white primary this was a fear of whites in big cities because African Americans and Republicans were gaining political power, and so the Democrats put in this in their rules. And Smith, I believe, sued and said that, hey, I'm being denied the right to vote in the Democratic primary. And Democrat primaries, Republican primaries are all um, private affairs. And the court said, no, you can't deny somebody the right to vote in a primary simply because of skin color. Because this effectively would disenfranchise non-white voters. So they overturned this rule in 1944. Now, gerrymandering happens. It's drawing the boundaries of a district to exclude certain groups of voters. It could be certain political party voters. It could be minority voters. One method of minimizing the impact of, let's say, minority voters is to spread out the population among several districts so there's not a majority of minority population in any district. Sometimes that's called cracking. It reduces the likelihood of a minority winning an election. Sometimes you'll pack them into one district so there's few districts with a large percent of minorities. Now, in the 90s, there was an attempt by the Clinton administration to do something called affirmative racial gerrymandering. This is drawing the boundaries to favor representation by a member of a African American group in a city council or legislative chamber election. This would create a majority minority district. Now, in the Shaw case, these districts were ruled to be unconstitutional unless they're reasonable in configuration and cannot be based solely on race. We'll discuss this further in Chapter 8. At-large districts, that's another way minority voting strength can be diluted. At-large districts refer to elected representatives who are elected from an entire entity, such as a city. So an at-large member of a council is elected on a citywide basis instead of a single member district. So votes of a minority group, they can be diluted when combined with the votes of a majority group. So if the minorities, such as Latinos, African Americans, comprise a numerical majority from a political power standpoint, they're still considered minority. So in like Corpus, where Latinos were a numerical majority, they're still considered minority from a political perspective. So if whites are 60% of a population and African Americans are 20 and Latinos are 20, and you vote for all the council seats that are open, 3 seats, well, most of the time you're going to have 3 Anglos on the council. But if you do it by the districts where the African Americans are located or Latinos are located, now assuming they're located in certain areas or they're a majority in a certain area of the city, well, then there's a better chance to have a minority elected to a seat. So that's been ruled to be unconstitutional. Now, there has been some recent federal voting rights legislation which has abolished certain things like the literacy tests. No longer more than 30 days you can register. So you still, right today, you still have time to register for the presidential election. Also, there's early voting must be offered. And you can sue in federal court to request voting examiners to be sent to a particular area. And bilingual ballots must be offered. Even in areas of Texas, we might have, let's say, Vietnamese or Chinese. In Harris County, we have voters that request those kinds of ballots. Now, in the Shelby case, this was a case involving the U.S. Supreme Court got involved in a part of the Voting Rights Act, which they felt was too old, obsolete, a formula for declaring certain areas that must get an okay before they change their Voting Rights Act no longer has to apply to them. So the state of Texas or counties or cities that had a history of violating minority voting rights, they used to have to appeal or obtain approval from the federal government before they made changes to their elections or drew their boundaries for their state legislative districts. But they don't have to do that anymore. The now it's almost 50-year data. It's not responsive to current needs, so it's a burden on the states, burden on the principles of federalism. Now, some said that this is might continue with discriminatory changes, discriminatory practices, but I have not seen any evidence of that. We have made attempts to make it easier to register. There's been the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, or the Motor Voter Law that permits you to register by mail. Now, as far as the suffrage, the two trends in suffrage in Texas emerged that voting rights have been expanded to include, both genders, all persons over age 18. And has been a movement toward uniformity of voting policies among the 50 states. But the turnout is still lower than average in our state. Usually in an off year or midterm election, it's in the 40 percentile. Now in presidential election years, it has gone up into the 50s. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to vote. And since the Shelby case, we no longer have to get approval for changes. So in 2013, we passed a law that does require photo ID. Now, you got to keep in mind there are things that influence voting. People get fatigued, there's psychological factors, there's the cost, and all of these do play a role. Income, gender, age. People that are older tend to vote. Females actually tend to vote more. People with higher incomes, higher education tend to vote more. African Americans, Hispanics do not vote as much as Anglos. Now, who administers the elections? They're administered by the state and the counties. The election code outlines it all. Here's the things you have to qualify for voting. You can early vote 17 days before. You can request an absentee vote ballot in Texas. You have to request it. That means you have to solicit it. Some states are just sending out ballots. And you have to say, yes, I'm going to be out, or I'm 65, or I'm disabled, or I'm in jail. Now, you can't be a felon serving a sentence. Or if you're a military, you can vote. Or you can vote by fax. And you can vote by electronic if you're in space even. Here's a NASA astronaut voting, or he just got done voting. Now, the administration of the election falls to the commissioner's court. The county gets heavily involved. They're the ones who decide the voting precinct area. That's the geographic area for conducting elections. And there are about 8,500 of these, and they cover Texas. We do have a voting center. Counties usually have one. We have one. Some counties do have election officials. We have a county election administrator. They prepare the general election and the ballots. The commissioners court, they're the ones who decide, where these election sites are going to be. You have to show your ID. The county commissioners, they appoint one election judge, one alternate judge from each of the different parties to administer the elections in each precinct for 2 years. And they make sure the election results are proper. Now, some can use paper ballots or optical scan or touch screen. That's determined by the county commissioners court. We use the optical scan. So make sure you know the 4 obstacles used in Texas and who can vote early. You can write in your name, but you have to be filed in advance of the general election at least 45 days prior to the primary. And it'll be posted on the precincts. The ballot that we have now is a secret ballot, and it's been adopted in Texas since 1892. Now, primaries are elections when you vote between party candidates. That's been around since 1906 under the Terrell Law.